Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Prep Your Standard NATO. My name is Ashayla Webster, and today I have Bob Sheppard with me.
Hi, Ashayla.
Hi, thanks for coming in.
That's my pleasure.
Okay, Bob, so let's start with your dad. So he was a World War II veteran.
Yeah, that's correct. My father was a farmer in the Three Springs or Arano area in the Midwest, and then he joined up. He didn't join up, he was conscripted, and he went from the farm there to Melville Army Camp in Perth, and then ended up on garrison duty on Rottnest Island for about a year.
Oh, it's worse places to be.
Well, yeah. I don't know whether he really enjoyed his time over there. It was pretty tough going. I mean, it wasn't a holiday island at that stage, and he helped dig some of the catacombs, they called them. These are the tunnels, defensive tunnels that are around the islands. They're not the major ones that's up on the major battery, but some of the smaller tunnels and pits and things. And he was a pretty good cricketer. He was a pretty good spin bowler, and so that they had a lot of sporting events and things like that. And then in 1943, something really nasty happened in the Midwest, which really changed the direction of his life.
Can you share?
Yeah, I can. So in 1943, the 4th Battalion, which were soldiers mainly from the eastern states around the Sydney area, I believe, they arrived in Moora as part of a new special mobile force which was being created in the Midwest to repel any Japanese invasion. At that stage there was a concern that the Japanese could invade at Jurien Bay, and that's really a story within itself. And in 1943, in the beginning of 1943, the 4th Battalion were doing exercises, and they were doing a group of men were doing a mortar demonstration. And the mortar bomb that they were demonstrating accidentally exploded and killed 14 soldiers.
Wow.
That had a fairly dramatic effect on the 4th Battalion, and they called for reinforcements. And my father and I think there was around about 30 reinforcements from Rottnest and other places went to the 4th Battalion in Moora. These guys were pretty fit and pretty strong and were seen as being really good reinforcements. So Dad was amongst sort of maybe 30 West Australians amongst thousands of guys from Victoria and New South Wales, which made life a little bit difficult because they were really blow-ins, if you like, compared to the rest of the guys. So then he did a lot of his training around Dandarrigan, Moora, Minganoo and places like that.
Wow. Do you know, I've never heard that story before.
Yeah, it's a pretty sad story, and out on the road from Moora to Myling, only about 3 or 4 kilometres out of town on the Moora Road, there's a memorial to those soldiers with the details, whatever. Those guys were actually buried in the Moora Cemetery, and then after the war they were shifted to Karrakatta. Yeah, very sad, a really, really sad story. Yeah,
that's really terrible. So did your dad end up serving overseas as well, or...?
Yeah, it was around Western Australia for about a year, and then he ended up in New Guinea. You know, all the places that we hear about, you know, Wewak, Lae, Madang, Finchhaven, Saddleburg, those sorts of things. Unfortunately, my dad was a little bit of a diarist, and he kept a rough diary, and he wrote lots of letters to his family. And of course those letters were fairly heavily censored at the time, but at least it can provide me with the ability to sort of backtrack my father's history. Of the 4th Battalion, I think there's only 4 or 5 left, and I was really fortunate the other day to meet Tom Newby, who was actually in the same platoon as my father, and Tom's living here in Perth. He's 99 years old, and we had a wonderful session, and he, you know, recalled some of the stories about my father and about their activities in New Guinea.
Yeah, that would have been pretty amazing to meet somebody who served with your dad.
Yeah, it was pretty incredible. You know, as a kid growing up, Dad never used to talk a lot about his military service, but he'd talk a little bit, and he was always very conscious about me as a son, as a young boy, being prepared militarily in case there was another world war. He certainly encouraged my activities when I joined the cadets in 1970, and spent 4 years in the Australian Army Cadets. He encouraged that because he suggested that we should all be prepared and concerned.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, my dad served in the 90s, and I remember him preparing me for possibilities. So I think that's probably just a byproduct of all that training in that world.
Yeah, look, I agree. You know, we'd be down the paddock and we'd be shooting kangaroos and things, and he would make sure that I knew how to hold the rifle properly and all those sorts of things. So, yeah, he was a really a gentle man. But like many of the soldiers that returned, and I probably didn't notice it as a child too much, but I think he struggled a bit. He had a nervous breakdown in the 60s, had shock treatment. So I think he was traumatised by his experience. And I also had 3 other uncles who were, 2 of them who served overseas. And they both come back and they were a little bit different, I think. And while we don't recognise at the time, I think generations later I can look at it and think, yeah, I think it did some damage.
Yeah, we have to remember that PTSD was only recognised as a thing in the 90s.
Yeah, that's correct.
So they didn't really get the treatment that they needed back then.
No. So look, as a kid, I didn't listen enough to what my father had to say, and I'm lucky I've got these diaries and letters and photos and things like that. But just recently I've become really interested in the military heritage of the Midwest of Western Australia. And a lot of people don't realise, but in between 1940 through to 1945, or really 1941 to 45, there was a huge military build-up in the Midwest. It was estimated between 20 and 30,000 troops were stationed in places like Moora, Dandaragan, Badgingarra, Minginoo, along the coast up towards Geraldton. So I'm trying to develop a military heritage project in collaboration with RSL, Shires, historical societies, to try and gather some knowledge about that. And I'd really like to write a book about it, about that experience.
Yeah, it'd be fantastic to learn a bit more about that. We didn't really learn much about local stuff here in WA at high school or school when we were learning about the war. It was about Japan, it was about Kokoda, it was about Singapore, it was about those really big events. But we had a lot of these big events happening here too.
That's absolutely correct. And the other thing that I'm finding is, as I do the research for this, is I'm finding out a bit about the role of the Volunteer Defence Corps. And these were the Dad's Army, we'd call them, but I think they were much better than that. And as I look at that, how they developed in the Midwest, 1941, 42, you've got to recall that a lot of these guys were World War I veterans from Gallipoli and from France, and they were really, really clever boys. Now, the guy who formed the Volunteer Defence Corps in Moora, and his name was Nicholson, he was the last man to leave Gallipoli, and he was an officer in Gallipoli. He was actually involved in the evacuation of 10,000 troops, which he did without losing one soldier. And he was the last man to step onto the boat at the end of Gallipoli. He was there the first day and he was there the last day. And when war broke out with Germany, he started to look at the bigger picture. And though he'd sort of resigned from the army, he understood that there was a huge absence of really good coastal intelligence in the region along the West Australian coast. And there was a genuine concern that Japan would... Australia would eventually be at war with Japan, which it was in the end, and then that they would invade in Jurien Bay. And when we look at it now, we think, why would the Japanese bother there? But there was a concern that there would be an invasion at Jurien Bay and the Japanese would advance on Pierce, if you like, come through the back door and avoid the heavy fortifications at Rottnest and Fremantle and the metropolitan area. So Nicholson actually created, with another guy, Reg Nichols, a clandestine, if you like, or a secret group which patrolled the coast north of Perth and created secret maps and plans of the landmarks in the area, which could be provided to the regular army. And at that stage, of course, all our trained troops had gone to North Africa to help the British, and Australia was really pretty well, just didn't have any really good trained troops except for the VDC guys, the World War I veterans. A lot of the young Turks were really keen to sign up and go and fight for king and country, but the old timers, I think, were sitting back and saying, "Don't be in a hurry, boys. This is not a lot of fun." And a lot of the more pragmatic young Australian men probably knew that there eventually would be conscription, so sat back and waited for that, because if you were conscripted, you could only fight within Australia or in Australian territories. You couldn't be sent away like the regular army could.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, that's right. So the CMF, or the Citizen Military Forces, these are the young guys who were conscripted. They could be sent to New Guinea because New Guinea was an Australian territory, but legitimately they couldn't be asked to fight in anywhere else outside of Australia. And in retrospect, that was probably a pretty good move. So, of course, John Curtin demanded from Churchill that Australian troops in North Africa be returned to Australia, and there was a little bit of argy-bargy between Churchill and Curtin. But those second Australian infantry guys came back, and they played a pivotal role in training, and of course, many of them got lost in Southeast Asia. It's interesting stories.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, if I go back to what I learnt in school, I remember learning that this was the first time that we became under threat. This is the first time they thought we could legitimately be attacked. But there was no context to that. We were told that, but we weren't told that all these systems were being set up here in WA.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating information that I really feel that we should have learnt about.
Yeah, look, I agree. And I think we need sometimes to bring the war home to, it's not all about, and I'm not denigrating the work of soldiers at Kokoda or Gallipoli, but we really don't have to go that far to see our military heritage. And even if you go to Rottnest Island and you walk around in the bush and peer behind trees, you'll still see the evidence of World War activities there, the trenches, the barbed wire that are rusting in peace. Yeah, so I think there's lots of opportunities. And a lot of people perhaps don't realise that the Japanese had submarines cruising up and down the West Australian coast, and Port Gregory north of Geraldton was shelled by a Japanese submarine. There were planes that were flying over, which perhaps from Timor, Japanese Timor, or from cruisers or raiders, and the Japanese even had aeroplanes on some of their submarines. And I'm also trying to get my head around some of the reports of Japanese landings in the vicinity of Jurien Bay. And recently I found an oral history online from a soldier who reported seeing a submarine land or surface, and Japanese sailors come ashore and get water from a waterhole.
That's terrifying.
At Jurien Bay, yes. And he was on a little ridge with two of his mates, and all they had was a pistol and a 303 and the radio. And the report says they radioed Pierce, and Pierce sent up an Avro Anson with a single bomb on it, which tried to bomb the submarine and missed. But you hear these anecdotal stories, but when you go back to the official army diaries and records, you can't find it written down. Conspiracy theorists would suggest that military forces didn't want to reveal all this information to public. I'm not so sure. I'd like more information, but it's time consuming, it's very difficult, and it's rather expensive to get hold of files from the National Library. Every time you get a file out from the library or the National Archives, it costs you $50, and
ouch.
So you've got to be very selective, and you really don't know what gems you're going to find until you actually read them. And sometimes you get some really dud material that really has got no interest, but you go, oh well, you put that one down to experience. So my eventual plan, if I get this project running in collaboration with communities, is to write a book about the build-up of the military in the Midwest of Western Australia.
Yeah, that'd be an absolutely fascinating read, and I think something that should be taught in all schools, and you can actually go out on a field trip and see some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And look, there is physical evidence. I was up in Moora the other day talking to one of the old-timers who was 8 years old, I think, at the time of the war, but he has recollections because he had lots of troops and tanks and things camped on the family farm, so he got to know a lot of these soldiers. He used to wander around their camp as a kid and hear the stories. They took me out to a rubbish tip on their farm, and there in the rubbish tip was the tracks off a Bren gun carrier and a big heap of World War II material. There was latrines, and there was cooking pots, and then a hole had been dug that was full of bottles and things like that. There's evidence of these guys. Now, the army were pretty good at cleaning up after themselves, and they dug lots of holes and buried lots of stuff. And as an archaeologist, I love digging in the dirt and finding this stuff. So,
in the candy store.
Yeah. And we went to another farm, and on the farm, the farmer said, "Oh, there's an old oven up in the ranges there." So we went up into the hills, and there was a stone oven which had been built by a sapper in around about 1943. And fortunately, he actually put his initials in the cement as the cement was drying, and also put his serial number in there. So I was able to go to the museum, the Australian War Museum, and look at his files and find out what his name was and where he was. So he's really left a mark in Moora, and I'd really like to contact his family down the track and see if I can, I'm sure they'd love to go and see the spot where he built this oven which baked bread for the troops.
Yeah, that little family connection. It's always nice being able to trace some of that history and see where your ancestors have set before.
Yeah, that's correct. And even up near Moora, there's, or actually out near Dandarrig and Jurien Bay, there's a cave out there which has got serial numbers of soldiers written with pencil on the stalactites and stalagmites in the cave. And I find that quite fascinating. I've seen photos. I'd love to go and have a look and try and track down through their numbers who they were. And that provides evidence of them actually being there. But if you think about it, 20 to 30,000 troops in the Midwest, and you see some of the photos of tanks and Bren gun carriers, General Grant tanks that were unloaded at the railway station in Moora, and they're in exercises across the sand plain. The whole concept was this special mobile force that could repel Japanese invaders from Geraldton through to Perth. If you think about it strategically, if you've ever been up to Kalbarri, you've got those cliffs, and those cliffs really run all the way to Shark Bay and really pretty much up towards Carnarvon. So that sort of country wasn't really conducive to an invasion, whereas the coast between Geraldton and Perth probably was. And there's evidence which is starting to appear that the Japanese had a really good knowledge of Jurien Bay and the West Australian coast, because in World War One they were actually Australia's allies under the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And Japanese cruisers, or the Ibuki, one cruiser, escorted Australian troops to Gallipoli. And there was 3 or 4 cruisers that were designated to prowl up and down the West Australian coast and out into the Indian Ocean to help against German raiders such as the Emden, which was sunk by the Sydney. And while they were here, they were welcomed by the Australian community because they were actually providing the first defence, if you like, of our West Australian coast. And they were given all courtesies, and the reports say all information required. So you can imagine that the Japanese Navy acquired all the maritime charts of Western Australia, all the intelligence in relation to Western Australia, and held on to that. And that information would have been, from the First World War, would have been very important to them in the Second World War. And really, the charts, the nautical charts that were provided didn't change much over 20 years. In fact, the Archdeacon nautical charts of our coast, which were produced in the 1800s or late 1800s, were still in use right up until about the 1950s.
Wow. So
they had those charts. And there's also evidence that Japanese cruisers did actually anchor in Jurien Bay during or shortly after World War One. So they had a fairly good knowledge of the coast.
So basically WA was quite possibly screwed.
Look, certainly. If there had been an invasion, and there's arguments within historians as to whether the Japanese intended to invade Australia or not. It's an argument I'm trying to avoid. I don't really want to take a side each way. What is really clear is, from the Australian point of view, there was a perception that the Japanese would invade Australia. Now, whether that perception was produced by propaganda, by government to try and activate Australian sentiment to help with the war effort, or whether it was a genuine concern. So West Australians really did consider they would be invaded, and there were plans for evacuation. And in that critical period from the end of 1941 and the early months of 1942, a few old men really held the key to the defence of Western Australia, and these were the Volunteer Defence Corps. And those guys were instructed to carry out guerrilla attacks on invading forces, to provide intelligence to regular Australian Army troops if they were available, to evacuate civilians to the east towards Kalgoorlie, to burn all crops, to shoot all cattle, to destroy homesteads, burn homestead sheds, pollute and poison waterholes, and really provide a rearguard action. That was, and to do this, they had shotguns, 22 rifles, a few 310 rifles, no uniforms, and no transport. And as such, they were really a static force. They had to really be the last man standing, if you like. And I'm sure they would have acquitted themselves very well, but we're all very thankful it didn't happen.
Oh, yeah, hugely thankful that didn't happen. That could have changed a huge course, but it sounds like a group of people that we should be talking about a lot more and showing our respects to a lot more, because they very well could have been our last line of defence.
Yeah, that's correct. When the second AIF returned to Australia and there was a lot better training and there was a build-up of the military, things got much safer. My research is not including the northwest, Broome, Port Hedland, those places that were attacked and bombed and whatever. And there's been lots of history written about that. I'm really concentrating on the southwest. I also like to follow the lives of various soldiers when I do research, and I did follow the story of one young guy from Moora who was from a pioneering Moora agricultural family, and at the outbreak of World War II he joined up as a member of the Light Horse and then a second machine gun company. He went to Syria, and then when he returned to Australia he went to Java to defend Java, and he was actually taken prisoner by the Japanese, and he ended up in a POW camp with Weary Dunlop.
Oh, I was just reading a book about this troop.
Okay, now if you read that book, and I won't mention the guy's name because out of respect to his family, because it's something I haven't discussed with the family at this stage, but he is mentioned in Weary Dunlop's book. And what happened, he was taken to the guardhouse at this prisoner of war camp where he was interrogated, and he was brutalised, and then he was in solitary confinement for 2.5 months because he didn't reveal the information that the Japanese interrogators wanted. Now, that information, those questions are not really revealed in Weary Dunlop's book. But what I found out afterwards was that he was actually interrogated about Jurien Bay. So being a Moora family, the Japanese worked out where he came from. He probably told them, and they went, okay, this guy's going to provide us with information about Jurien Bay, and he refused to submit to their interrogation. And he obviously realised that this was of strategic significance to the Japanese, the information he would... So he was prepared to cop it. He thought he was going to be executed, but he was in solitary confinement for 2.5 months, and Weary Dunlop says in his memoirs that when he was finally released, he looked like he was white and fat and looked like something that you'd find if you turned over a stone. Now, unfortunately, this guy was sent from prisoner of war camp to Japan towards the end of the war, and the ship that he was travelling on was torpedoed by an American submarine, and he lost his life. And the story of his interrogation wasn't released until post-war 1945, and I found the newspaper article. And I like that story. I don't like the result, but I think we can all respect the trauma that young soldier went through, 22, 23 years old, and his understanding of the ramifications of the interrogation. And, I think he was a very, very brave lad, and his family must be very proud of him. I'm not sure whether the family know all the story that I've just talked about, and I hope to talk to the family in due course. But it's those sorts of stories that actually provide some context to some of the things we hear about military history. And I really like tracking down individual people and see where they end.
It brings a face to it, as you say. It brings it home when you can track one person and find out their history and what they went through, what happened to them. It makes it more personal. Yeah,
it sure does. And I find little snippets about my father's activities in war diaries. I found a really interesting newspaper report about my father, Robert Sheppard, and the old guy that I went and saw recently, Tom Newby or Alec Newby. And there was a newspaper report in the Daily News in Western Australia, and it says, WA men emulate men with a donkey. And what happened on the north coast of New Guinea was Alec Newby and my father, Rob Sheppard, managed to capture a couple of horses which the Japanese had abandoned on the beach when they withdrew. And they looked after these horses, cleaned them up, and they heard that there was some Chinese abandoned in a mission up in the ranges. And Dad and Alec made several trips up to the mission and brought all the children and the sick Chinese people that had been abandoned by the Japanese down to the coast on these horses. And it's quite a story, and I talked to Alec Newby about it the other day, which was really interesting to get his perception on it. So yeah, you follow those stories, and and when I drive around, I suppose one of the things that really made me think about this in recent times was, as an archaeologist, I've been working with the Shire of Dandaragan on Radar Station 48, which was built on North Head, north of Jurien Bay, and we've done excavations up there. And I've discovered since that the army camp where we were doing the excavations and we were finding bits and pieces, bullets and toothpaste containers and Brill cream bottles and beer bottles and all sorts of things, was actually a camp where my father camped.
Oh, wow.
So here I am, generations later, digging stuff out of the ground which might have been or was related to my father's time along the coast in the Midwest. So that really, really brings it home to me.
Yeah,
and that's why
amazing.
I've got interest. Yeah.
Wow.
And to be working with my son as well, who's also an archaeologist. So, there's another generation of him working on a site where his grandfather was in World War II in, 1942, 43. Brilliant stuff.
That's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, the whole thing is just an amazing story, all the little stories and then the overarching, you and your family. This is really cool. I'm getting a little bit worked up because this is
good.
Fascinating.
I'm glad. Yeah, look, and look, this is just a little snippet of the bigger picture. And I presented a history conference in Cervantes last weekend for the Royal WA Historical Society about the military history of the Midwest, and got a huge response from the people there. Lots of them came out and had a chat to me afterwards. I put a slide up on the PowerPoint of an ABC concert, which was held at Dandaragan in 1943. And there was 3,000 troops attended this concert, and they had a Welsh lady singing, Australian Symphony Orchestra, ABC. It was in a natural amphitheatre near a dam, and they had candles floating out onto the dam, and it was a huge night, a big night. And after the conference, this lady came out to me and she said, "Bob, I just love that photo. Can I get a copy, please? My dad was the compere of the concert."
Oh, wow.
And she'd never seen the photo.
Wow.
So I've sent her a few photos. And the photo I'd actually got from a guy in America who used to live in WA, who picked up a photo album in an op shop in Western Australia years ago, and he now lives in America. And he found my webpage, or my Facebook page, and recognised the importance of these photos and scanned them and sent them to me. And that's the world we live in these days. Things can happen really fast.
Oh, yeah. Yes, they can. So you mentioned your Facebook and your webpage. What are they? Where can people find you?
Yeah, the best thing is my Facebook page, really, Heritage Detection Australia. So if you type that into Facebook search, Heritage Detection Australia, you'll get my Facebook page. And there's lots of World War II photos on there. Beautiful photos that have been provided by the Moira Historical Society, of Volunteer Defence Corps guys, army activities along the coast. And look, I'd love to hear from anybody who's got any memories of that, or any archival material, or any photos, or any interest, or anything that can help me with an understanding of the military build-up in the Midwest of Western Australia. I'd just love to hear. I'm sure the stuff's out there. And if you look at 30,000 troops, and you look at the generations that have followed, there are thousands and thousands of Australians who are now starting to show some interest in their military heritage, and who are actually visiting the Midwest and are going to historical societies, going to councils and saying, "Can you tell me where my father was stationed here in World War II? Where are the sites?" So there's a growing interest in that. It's just wonderful.
Hey, if you can't get funding from someone else, maybe we should hit up Tourism Western Australia and go, "Guys, there might be an industry in this." Well,
that's what I'm sort of hoping. If I can get the groundswell going, and I will be presenting a PowerPoint production about an hour in Moira, hopefully at the community centre in the beginning of November. But I'll put that information up on the Facebook. There's lots of people out in Moira in those regions. A lot of there's farmers that have got connections that go back a long time, and they've got lots of stuff tucked away in their sheds and in their cupboards, are really interesting military stuff. And and I've heard a wonderful story of a Bren gun carrier or a tank buried in a paddock because
cool.
it broke down. They dug a hole and buried it when they left. I'd love to find that.
Yeah, let's go dig that up.
That'd be a story, wouldn't
That'd
it?
be great.
Yeah.
All right, well, guys, make sure you jump on Facebook, check out Heritage Detection Australia, check out the website as well. There's some really cool blog posts on there. Thank you so much for coming in. This was fascinating.
No worries, that's my pleasure.
Cheers. This podcast was edited, published and produced by the RSLWA. Head to www.rslwa.org.au for other content. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast and follow us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook.